going. It should be going, I hope. All right. Well, let's turn to the book of Genesis. And we need to try to get through Genesis today and maybe get started into Exodus. There's lots of stories that take place in the book of Genesis and lots of little details. Every little story has a different purpose and meaning and message to it. We're going to start off at, I think we're in this area. So God gave a command and promise to Abram to leave his homeland and to go to a land that God had promised. And so he begins on that journey. So let's start looking at the book of Genesis in chapter 12. So it starts off with Abram going back from Egypt, going back up to Canaan area. By this point, Abraham has started to become very wealthy. And the book of Genesis tells us a few things about him. He is very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. He was starting to make a name for himself. Well, he had a nephew named Lot. Lot was wealthy also. But verse 5 tells us, and those following verses tell us that he was also a little greedy. And he could not exist at the same place as Abram. There was just a conflict, quarreling, especially among the groups, the households of Abraham and Lot. So Abram offers Lot a choice. He could choose the better watered land in the area of Jordan, or he could take another place. So that's what Lot did. He chose the better place. Abram moves on to Mamre, to an area called Hebron, and builds there a third altar. Well, as the story goes, Abraham has to come and rescue Lot, who gets himself into trouble in chapter 14. We get a different image of Abram now. Now he is more of a warrior and the chieftain of a large group of people. And we'll see this grow in the next couple of stories. No longer is Abram just this man with his own little group. Now he's become someone who can actually go to war. The reason for the conflict is that 4 Elamite kings were rebelling, and we won't take time to read all of their funny names. But these kings had conquered the city of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Lot was, and they had captured Lot and carried him away. So Abram gets together 318 men, and they go after Lot and rescue him. And along the way, after he defeats the kings, he meets a priest king named Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek becomes important in the book of Hebrews. We know very little about him. His name means priest and king. So Melech, the first part of his name, means king, and Zedek means righteous. So he is a righteous king who's also a priest. And he's a priest of the Most High God. Abram responds to Melchizedek and gives him a tithe of all the spoils that he has won. And he refuses to receive anything back from the king of Sodom. Melchizedek is also king of Salem, which is an early version of the name Jerusalem. So there's a lot of little stories going on here behind the scenes that later on will have a big impact on Bible history. Well, then we come to an important chapter, 15 of Genesis. And this is where God repeats the call to Abram and makes a covenant with him. God is the main actor who is talking in this chapter. First of all, the chapter begins with a confirmation of Abram. And God says to him, do not be afraid. God is called Abram's shield. He will protect Abram from harm and will carry out the promises God has made to him. Well, Abram has a complaint, though, in verses 2 to 3. And his complaint is that he's childless. Some time has gone by now since the first promise. He had no son and only a faithful servant named Eliezer of Damascus. Verse 6 shows us Abram's faith. God repeats the promise that Abram will have a descendant. And Abram believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. Well, this is an important verse that the New Testament quotes. It was a favorite of Paul the Apostle because it showed for Paul that Abraham was justified. He was considered righteous before God, not for what he did, but because he believed. And then James also quotes that in chapter 2, verse 20. Abraham was an important example to the early Christians of faith. And then God gives us a promise of a covenant. And it has 4 parts to it. First of all is the promise of heirs, that Abraham would have descendants. Let's see. He would have offspring. Second is that that his descendants would have land. The third is that he would now have a new name. No longer is he called Abram, but he will be called Abraham. And then also his descendants will be circumcised. Let's look at verses 8 through 20 a little closer. This describes a symbolic sealing or covenant ceremony. Abram was told to bring 3 animals and 2 birds, and then cut the animals in half. And then that was part of an ancient covenant ceremony. And so a person would cut an animal in half, and then the weaker party would walk through the 2 halves of the animals and make this oath. And they would say, let this happen to me if I ever break this covenant. In other words, let me be split in half. Let me be killed. Well, what's interesting in this is that God is the one who passes through this. In the symbol of a smoking pot and a flaming torch passed through the pieces down in verse 17. Well, why is that significant? Because it shows that God is not the weaker party here, but he takes that position, and by doing that, he is confirming that surely this covenant will come to place. It will be fulfilled. That Abram, now going to be called Abraham soon, that will surely take place. And then in the verses right before that, we find out some important things about how this promise will be fulfilled. And these are the conditions of the fulfillment here in number 6. So The Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs and will be servants there. Well, they're going to go to a strange land and they're going to be there for 400 years. They're going to be slaves, servants for 400 years. And then, verse 14, I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve. Well, God was going to judge the nation for enslaving them. And then going on, and afterwards they shall come out with great possessions. So when the people of Israel leave Egypt, they will have much wealth. And then Abram will die, go to your fathers in peace, and you shall be buried in good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So Abram would die in peace, and the sins of the Amorites would be punished. So these are all prophetic statements about what would happen in the future. And then in verses 18 through 21, we get the boundaries of the promised land from the river of Egypt to the great river Euphrates. So that, if you remember the map from last week, that covers all of Egypt and the whole Fertile Crescent that God had promised to the descendants of Abraham. Well, that's a high point in Abram's experience. The next chapter takes a nosedive. And Abram becomes impatient with God. And this is the story of the Egyptian slave servant Hagar and the birth of Ishmael. This is a contrast between human wisdom and divine wisdom. It's one of the low points of Abram's life. Abram had several low points. We came across one last week when he went down to Egypt and almost gave his wife away. This is another low point. So his wife, Sarai, still called here, was barren. A cultural note about that, here, number one, barrenness was a major shame back then. It was seen as a curse of the gods, or in this case, of God. Sarai was way beyond the age of hope. She was an old lady, past the birthing age. In that culture, if a woman was in this kind of situation, it was acceptable to give your servant to your husband, and he would bear a son through the servant. So it was culturally acceptable. We should not read this from our modern Christian ethic, but it was what they tried to do to solve this problem of no heirs. And so that's what Sarai did. She gave her servant Hagar to Abram. This was really a test of Abram and Sarah. Sarai's faith was low. She had lost hope in her childlessness, and she blames her problem on God in verse 2. O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus. That was their a good servant, faithful servant. Hagar may have been obtained as a slave while they were down in Egypt. That's probably where they picked her up. Abram was persuaded that Sarai's plan was God's plan. He rushed ahead of revelation. He thought, okay, well, maybe God can work through this way. He listened to the voice of his wife and not to the voice of God. There's a powerful message in that, because sometimes we rush ahead of God and we think the voices we hear are actually God's voice, and it's not. And God wants us to be patient and to wait for him. Well, they were not patient and waited. And the consequences of this bad choice, it was a no-win situation for everyone. Everyone was going to suffer because of this choice. For Sarai, she was humiliated. Her relationship with Abram was ruined. Hagar had contempt for Sarai now. She was arrogant. Oh, I've got Abram's son. And so Sarai, in return, cursed Abram and abused Hagar. So Sarai goes downhill, Hagar goes downhill, and Abram's caught in the middle of it, and he has no good answer. Hagar, she has to flee for her life now, and she runs away to the desert of Shur, back towards Egypt. She heads back home. And then God shows up and gives a response to her at the end of the chapter. God's response to Hagar is that he sends an angel with a new promise, which is actually similar to Abram's promise. Look at verse 10. I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for multitude. That is almost the same promise that God gave Abram. And now God gives that promise to this runaway slave, Hagar. That's pretty significant. It tells us something about God's grace. And so Hagar gives birth to a son named Ishmael. Now, according to tradition and according to the Muslims, they trace their heritage back to Abraham through Ishmael. So the Arabs and that part of the Middle East are descendants of Ishmael. The Jews and the Israelites are descendants of Abraham through Isaac. And so this conflict that we see in the Middle East, it goes back to the first generation. Isn't that weird to think about? You know, this is not a new problem, and it's not going to be solved by some politician. You know, this is so deep, it goes back to Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. Well, after this low point, in chapter 17, the covenant is renewed. Now, we find out that this is 13 years later. Abram is now 99 years old. God appears to Abram, and the name that God gives is El Shaddai. There's a lot of important names for God in these stories. We skipped the one for Hagar. In chapter 16, verse 13, the Hebrew is El Roeh, which means the God who sees. And now in chapter 17, we have the God who is all-powerful. So oftentimes we have that Hebrew name for God, El, and then with some kind of word after it. El Shaddai, El Yom, the eternal God, El Roeh, the God who sees. So very interesting. We lose that in translations. Some study Bibles will have a little footnote at the bottom. Well, God then gives a command to Abram. Walk before me and be blameless. Walk with the Lord and be blameless. A two-part commandment. So walk with the Lord, that's going to take obedience. And be blameless, Abram's going to have to live righteously. He's going to have to live a holy life. Now, he didn't have the law to help guide him, but he had a sense of what God wanted him to do. And then we get a repeat of the covenant. The promise now is again of multitude of nations. This is the 5th time that God has said this to Abram. Now, officially, Abram's name is changed to Abraham, which means father of many nations. Father of many nations. And then this covenant is going to be an eternal covenant into the far distant future. I have made you the father of multitudes, verse 6. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings will come from you. And I will establish my covenant between you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant. So this covenant God was making, there's something special about it. This is going to go way off into the future. It's going to be eternal. And I will give to you and your offspring after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. Well, that has been an important promise to the Jewish people ever since that point. You think, how many years have the people of Israel actually had the land? We're talking 4,000 years ago when this promise was made. I did a calculation once. I cannot remember the exact number, but it's probably, what did I say? Let's do a little calculation in our head real quick. Well, they had the promised land for at least one generation in the conquest. So let's be generous and say 50 years. And then they fought a whole bunch until King Saul began to take over some of it. So let's be generous and give them maybe another 50 years. So that's 100. And then during Saul, Solomon, and David, let's say that's another 150 years. They had pretty good control, not universal until David and Solomon. So let's say maybe 300 years at the most. And then after that, they were always fighting. So they really did not have full control of the land. They split, the kingdom split. So we're not going to count that. And so then they lost it all during exile. And then when they came back from exile, they were still controlled by foreigners. During the New Testament, they were controlled by Romans. Let's be generous. Let's give them another 100 years, maybe 200. So let's say 500 years up until the time of Christ. And then they lost it again. And they took it again in 1945. So that's 70 years. We're talking under 600 years out of the last 4,000 that the Jewish people have actually had control of their own land. That's not a lot. But God made that promise and would remain faithful, that that's always been their land, even though they haven't always had control of it. And even today, they don't have full control of the land because they have other peoples. So that's quite a challenging one for to think about. And in the Old Testament, actually, and this is going to be one of our big themes in the Pentateuch. In the Old Testament, the theme of land is probably one of the top 5 themes. Here we have land promised. We'll have land conquered. We'll have land lost or land divided. We'll have land lost and land promised again. And so the land just keeps showing up over and over again throughout the Old Testament. Well, let's go on. That's just kind of an interesting little note there about the land. Well, the conditions of the covenant. This is not just simply something that's going to happen. Abraham has to do something. As for you, verse 9, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout their generations. So they need to keep the covenant. They need to do their part. And what is their part? Faith. They must believe and honor God exclusively. Worship him only. That is the number one problem in the Old Testament. Now, they had moral problems, other kinds of sin, but the number one sin that always got them in trouble was idolatry, or worshiping another god. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Now, this faith is going to be shown in an outward sign of circumcision. The purpose of circumcision, it was a symbol of putting away the flesh. Now, obviously, it only was done to males. Males were the dominant gender in the ancient East, like this. So all males would, when they were 8 days old, would be circumcised, and that this would continue throughout all generations. This is what distinguished Abraham's descendants from the Gentiles. It was a constant reminder to them of the covenant that God made with Abraham. It reminded them to be morally pure. Let's turn over real quick to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 10, verse 16. Circumcise, therefore, the foreskin of your heart, and be no longer stubborn. So circumcision of the flesh was to be a reminder and symbol of the more deeper and important circumcision of the heart. They needed to dedicate themselves spiritually and give themselves totally to God. And then God foretells the birth of Isaac. The name for Sarai is changed to Sarah, which means a heroine, a lady hero. Another translation for that would be a princess. So a very special lady now. Sarai is no longer the disgraced old lady. She is now a royal princess, a special hero who will be the source by which God will bless all nations. Abraham responds in laughter to the announcement that Sarah would have a son. Now, is that a laughter of unbelief or a laughter of praise? He says to himself, verse 17, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Abram wishes that Ishmael would be special. Ishmael was his firstborn. Maybe Abraham thought that Ishmael was the child of promise. But no, that was not God's will. God's choice was not for Ishmael, but for the child of promise. So Abraham gets a little bit of a rebuke here, in a way, because his thinking had been wrong this whole time. And now he kind of laughs about it. But he is obedient. He circumcises all the men in his household. And that ends up the chapter 17. Well, still, this is the birth of Isaac hasn't happened yet, but it's a promise. We're getting closer. Well, there's another low point in the story now, and this affects his nephew Lot and the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Abraham now is 99 years old. Even back then, that's old age. People At least in the Bible, some of them live to be longer, but their ages are dropping steadily. And Abraham's one of the last ones who will really be long-lived. So God appears to Abraham at the area called Mamre, in the way of three men standing in front of him. And so Abraham invites them in. Now, hospitality was an important feature back in the ancient world. It was the proper thing to do, to invite strangers in, to take care of them, give them food, wash them up. It was a time of resting. Abraham did not know who these guests were. And they come with an announcement. Verse 9, they said to him, "Where is Sarah, your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." And so now we find out that these men are actually the Lord speaking. These are angels. The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son." Sarah was listening in. They did not have very thick walls back then. It was just a tent. They were both old. And now Sarah laughs. "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why does Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?' Is anything too hard for the Lord?" You could preach a good sermon on that question. Is anything too hard for God? Nothing is too difficult. And so they get this announcement that Sarah would have a son 1 year later. There's two emphases here in this story. One is the skepticism of Sarah. Her faith really isn't that strong. She's an old lady. She knows her body. She knows she's past birthing age. And then we also, as the story goes on, the judgment upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. These are terribly wicked cities. And so Abraham does a little bargaining with God here. And he starts off with, will you save it for 50 righteous people within the city? And the Lord says, if I can find 50 people who are righteous, I'll not destroy them. And so Abraham goes on, suppose 5 of the 50 are lacking. Will you destroy them for 45? And the Lord says, suppose if there's 40 there. And then he keeps going down. How about 20? And then how about even 10? It's really an interesting story how Abraham bargains with God down all the way to even 10 righteous people. What does that do in the story? If you just stand back from the story, it emphasizes just how wicked these cities are. They are just totally, there's just nothing good in them. And they deserve what's coming. Chapter 19 then is the story of God's judgment upon Sodom. Just like Abraham, Lot was a gracious host. But is there anything different between Lot and Abraham at this point? So Lot gets some guests, and as the guests come in and they lay down to rest, there are men from Sodom, both young and old, who come and they pound on the door and they say, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may know them." Well, in Hebrew, the word know means to have sexual relationships with them. They wanted to rape these men, homosexuals. Now, Lot, at least he doesn't want to do that to his guests, but look what he does, though. Verse 8, "Behold, I have 2 daughters who have not known any man. Let me bring them out to you, and do with them as you please." So he approaches this thing totally different than Abraham. This highlights the depravity of Sodom and Gomorrah, and it also questions who Lot is. Lot is not this righteous person like Abraham. If Lot has been hanging around Sodom and Gomorrah, if that's his home, how much of it has rubbed off on him? Well, the story doesn't say, but probably something has happened to Lot. He was willing to give away his 2 virgin daughters to fulfill the lust of the crowd. Then the Lord warns Lot that he needs to flee, that the city is going to be destroyed. Just do not look back. Well, Lot's wife, you know these stories pretty well. We tell them to our children, but Lot's wife looks back and is made into a pillar of salt. And then a total of 4 cities are destroyed in the valley south of the Dead Sea. This was once a fertile valley, but over the ages, the Dead Sea has grown until there's nothing that can live in that area today. I don't know if you like to look at the internet, but sometime go look at the Dead Sea on like Google Maps or Google Earth. Or you can find stories on the internet about it. The Dead Sea is actually shrinking because Israel is diverting water from the Jordan River for their irrigation. So less water is flowing down to the Dead Sea. And so it's shrinking and it may eventually disappear. But still, the dirt, the soil is all poisoned by the salt that has developed out of the Dead Sea. There are some family consequences, though, for Lot because he lived in the city of Sodom. So chapter 19, verse 30. Lot went up out of Zoar and lived in the hills with his 2 daughters, for he was afraid to live in Zoar. So he lived in a cave with his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there's not a man on earth to come in to us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let's make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve the offspring from our father." And so that's what they did. There was incest in Lot's family. This just shows how much downhill Lot went. He lost all his wealth, he lost his wife, and he lost his daughter's purity. He did incest with his daughters, ended up living in a cave. This is what happens when we let sin become part of our lives. This is a powerful story for preaching a sermon about sin. Lot compromised, and because of that, it destroyed himself, destroyed his wife, and destroyed his daughters. Chapter 20 is another challenging story. In this chapter, Abraham does another, I don't know, I would call it a strange, maybe an unwise thing. This story repeats what Abraham experienced down in Egypt. Abraham journeyed to the territory of Negev, to Kadesh and Shur, and he comes to a place where Abimelech is the king of Gerar. And he introduces his wife as his sister. God came to Abimelech in a dream. Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife. Abimelech wanted Sarah as his wife, just like the Pharaoh wanted Sarah as his wife. And Abimelech is warned in a dream not to do that. And so Abimelech then confronts Abraham. What are you doing? Why have you deceived me? Abimelech has tried to figure out what is going on in Abraham's thinking in verse 10. What did you see? What that you did this thing? Basically, what is going on in your head, Abraham, that you would deceive me like this? Abraham gives some pretty weak excuses now. He says he feared for his life. He's really not telling a lie because Sarah is like a half sister to him. They all came from the same area, the tribal area, and they were all related. So he wasn't really telling a lie, just maybe not quite the whole truth. He thought Abimelech had no fear of God, which was not true. And this is part of the long-term strategy. God caused me to wander from my father's house. These are all bad excuses. Has Abraham learned yet to trust in God? He's had a long journey of this. And his testing is not done yet, is it? He'll have some more tests. King Abimelech responds in three ways. He gives Abraham flocks and herds. He invites him to live in the land, and he gives money to Sarah since it wasn't her fault. So actually, in the big picture of things, this is another example. Excuse me. This is another example of God's grace to Abraham. Abraham keeps having weak faith and trying to figure things out himself, but yet God keeps pouring more grace upon Abraham. These are stories of grace. Well, any thoughts before we jump to the next patriarch? We have a little bit more to do with Abraham, but we're almost to the birth of Isaac. But what do you think about Abraham? What's kind of it? What is your thoughts about Abraham in these stories?
Yes, Pastor.
Yeah, what do you think? What are some thoughts?
Abraham is Abraham committed sins, even though God's promises have done to him, he still made a sin and tells a lie. He's always telling a lie. But in the latter part, is still God helping him, leading him, and give him an abundant life. Is that so?
We could probably say it's maybe a half lie.
Half lie.
It's a half truth. Maybe
Like,
we could say it's deceiving. He was being deceitful.
Deceitful.
Yeah.
But as a sin, small or big, it was a sin, isn't it?
Yeah, he really was not trusting in God enough.
Yes. He's not trusting in God. Even Sarah.
He had a lot of lessons he still needed to learn.
Yes.
And the big one is coming up in just a couple of chapters.
21.
Yes. The next couple of chapter 22 is probably one of the big lessons. And this really kind of sealed it for Abraham. His journey is really like Christians. We have ups and downs, until we finally die to the old life. Abraham dies to his old life in chapter 22. Some Bible scholars say that chapter 22 is his entire sanctification, when he fully trusts in God finally. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Anybody else want to share a thought or an insight?
About the sacrifice of Isaac. About chapter 22.
Yes, we'll look at that in a second. So, well, let's go ahead and move on then. Chapter 21, now we have the fulfillment of the promise, and Isaac is finally born. This is the fulfillment of the first part of the promise that God made. His name means he laughs. He is circumcised on the 8th day. He is weaned by the age of 3, and that was a time of celebration. But his half-brother Ishmael mocks him for it. So already you see this tension between the two brothers, even at an early age. And the struggle continues. Ishmael is 17 years old. He mocks and ridicules Isaac in an unkind way. Sarah's response, he wants Abraham to chase them away. The promise belongs to Isaac. It did not belong to Ishmael and Hagar. God intervened with assurance and promise about the outcome of Ishmael. So look at chapter 21, verses 12 and 13. God said to Abraham, "Be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring." And so Abraham sends Hagar and Ishmael away. It seems like a sad story, but yet God is going to do something special through Ishmael. And as we said, that's the forefather of the Arab nations, and who the Muslims trace their lineage through. Hagar and Ishmael were close to the point of death. Their food and water had run out. Hagar cries for help, and God responds with an angel. And the angel repeats the promise that God gave and gives water to them. Well, Ishmael grows, and Hagar finds an Egyptian wife for him. So it looks like they went down south to where Hagar was from, and that's where Ishmael and his family grew. God makes a covenant. Abraham makes a covenant or a treaty with Abimelech. Abraham by this time had risen in power. Since Abimelech sees Abraham now as an equal, they need to come to terms of peace. Their water was scarce. They were fighting over water. And so now the place that this treaty takes place is called Beersheba, which is the well of the oath, or the seven. This is the first reference to this being the land of the Philistines. And so that will become a little prelude, a little hint of the problems that will come many, many years later between Israel and the Philistines. Well, now we come to this important chapter. I don't have too many notes here, but you can add some or just read this chapter if you like sometime. This is a fairly important chapter in the book of Genesis because, as I was saying, this is finally Abraham seems to have grown out of his doubts and fears. This is a later time. We do not know when it takes place. It just says sometime later. This was God wanted to test Abraham's faith. Abraham was to take Isaac to Mount Moriah, which was perhaps close to the city of Jerusalem, but people are not quite sure where it was, but there's traditional places for it. And so Abraham responds immediately. He starts getting food together. He takes wood with him because wood was rare. There were not forests around, and so he took some wood with him. He made all of the needed preparations, and then he heads out to Canaan. It's about a 3-day journey. At any point, he could have changed his mind, but he didn't. On the 3rd day, he lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. And he took Isaac alone to the mountain to worship. There's something interesting in verse 5 that later interpreters picked up. Stay here with the donkey. He's talking to the servants that came with him. Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. That last little phrase there, come again, Abraham was thinking that whatever happened, Isaac would come back with him. Now, the author to Hebrews, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 9, said that Abraham believed that God could raise Isaac from the dead. Abraham had resurrection level faith. Abraham is ready to carry this out when God intercedes at the last moment. He's just about ready to sacrifice his only son of promise, and God stops him, and there is a ram with his horns caught in the bushes, and with that they're able to offer a sacrifice. God answers through an angel. The real issue of the test is seen in verse 12. The angel says, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God." There's the key point. Now I know you fear God. Was there some doubt before this that Abraham feared God? I think when we look at those other stories, there's always a little hint that there's some doubt, some fear, some unbelief in Abraham. All throughout those stories in Egypt, with Hagar, with Abimelech, there's always just a little bit of a problem with Abraham. Now, this is the ultimate test, and he passes it. He is willing to give everything of importance to God. And God now knows that he fears him. That's a significant turning point in the life of Abraham. From now on, he's a different person. Every one of these patriarchs that we study has a turning point when their faith becomes solid in their life. This is the turning point for Abraham. when his faith becomes firm in him. All right, well, 20 years later, Abraham is now the age of 137. Sarah was 127, and she dies. Abraham buys a piece of property from the sons of Heth, or the Hittites, and in this place he buries his wife. He paid a huge amount of money for this field, but this is the one little spot in all of the promised land that he owns. Of all this land that God promised, all Abraham has is this little field. But that little field is like, it's like a foot in the door. It will grow, and someday his descendants will have all the land. Well, chapter 26.
Question,
Or
Doctor?
24. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just wondering on the chapter 22, wherein the Lord stopped Abraham to kill Isaac,
Yes.
and they replace an offering through a ram. I'm just wondering, why is it a ram? Because I used to read that the sacrifice was a lamb.
Yeah, I don't really know an answer for that question. That's a good question. I never thought about that. Maybe a good commentary might give us a suggestion. A ram, we could look up what is the word ram there? Is it a word that could be similar to a sheep? Maybe this still is, a lamb, but a lamb tends to be, the little ones.
Yeah.
So maybe this is just a grown-up sheep, So maybe it's that would be my guess, is that this is a grown-up sheep. But I don't know those words too well. Maybe we could do a little study in Hebrew. For example, let's see if we can. We do have resources that we can draw upon. I don't know how much we can find, but it's sure worth a try. This is how I would solve it without having a commentary to look. So that is Genesis 12 or 22, verse 13. So I'm going to put Genesis 22, verse 13. And I'm going to choose Tools, Interlinear. Now we should have a Hebrew and English interlinear. So we have lifted up his eyes, looked, behold behind him a ram. So this is the Hebrew Strong's number 352. Let's click on that. A ram, pillar, door, strong man, leader. So it's a ram. It had some symbolism to it. It can mean strong or mighty tree. Used for food. It's in a sacrifice in the some of the law. It occurs a few times in other places. So in 2 Kings chapter 3 verse 4, it is used with 1,000 lambs and 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams. Okay. I guess I'm not very good at these kinds of animals. So let's look up, what is a ram? No, we don't want random access memory. So definition of a ram. This looks interesting. There's a good picture of ones from the mountains. They have huge horns. Well, that doesn't good. I think they're a form of mountain sheep, wild mountain sheep. There's domestic sheep, and they're related to the ram. Yeah, okay, well, without taking a lot of class time, it looks to me, this would be my guess, and we could go verify it with a little more research, that a ram would be a wild mountain sheep, and it probably had those big kind of horns, and it got itself caught up in the bushes in a thicket, and so it was easy to catch those animals. I just saw on one of those web pages, they're the size of a football player, so they're huge. You're not going to go and just capture one. You're going to have to work really hard to capture one, and there was a big one right there. So another sign of God's grace. So I don't know, that's kind of interesting, but maybe that's helpful to think about. And another interesting thing about that, at the end of that verse, it says, Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering. A burnt offering in the Old Testament was completely burnt up. They did not save part of it for food. This was a whole burnt offering. The whole sheep was burnt up. Nothing left. This was a total dedication of this animal, this wild lamb sheep with big horns. All right. Well, let's continue our study here with so going to chapter 24. Things move along a little bit now. Abraham's getting old, well advanced in years. He's getting really old, as we'll find out in the next chapter. We don't get an age in this chapter yet, but we know that he was getting old. Isaac now is 40 years old. So if we do a little bit of calculations, if Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born, Abraham now would be 100 and basically 140 or so years old. Abraham was concerned because there was no wife for his son Isaac. How could the promise continue? This is another test of Abraham's faith. Abraham gets his oldest and most faithful chief servant, Eleazar, and he makes Eleazar do this, what we might call an odd ceremony, where he placed his hands under the patriarch's thigh. That was a cultural way of making a solemn oath. And Abraham sends Eleazar off to find a wife for his son Isaac. A wife must be found from their own people. So he has to send Eleazar back to the homeland, not in Canaan, because there's no relatives there. You have to go all the way back to where Abraham came from. God made a promise to Abraham, and Abraham believed that it would come true. The servant is committed to carry on with Abraham's wish. He goes with supplies and gifts for a new bride, and he goes all the way back to what the text says is Nahor, but that's actually also the place of Haran. You remember that map from last week? How it was way over the Fertile Crescent? So Eleazar had to go a long ways back to the family. And he expresses the plan in a prayer. In verses 12 through 14. This is his plan, and he makes it his prayer. O Lord, God of my master Abraham. So Eleazar has learned something over the ages, hasn't he? He's learned to trust in God too. Please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, please let down your jar that I may drink. And who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. And so that's what happens. Exactly. An answer to prayer. As soon as he finishes praying, he hasn't even said his amen. And here comes Rebecca. And so she warmly welcomes Eleazar and shows hospitality. And so this is just a wonderful woman. And so he knows right away that this is the one. And amazingly, she willingly leaves to go to the strange land, to the strange man, to be his wife. And this chapter ends with the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. Well, at this point, Isaac kind of becomes he's not the center of the story anymore. He's in the background. Jacob becomes the focus of the story for the next major part of Genesis, chapters 25 through 36. Well, in chapter 25, Abraham dies. But before he dies, I should mention this, he takes on concubines and has more sons and probably a few daughters there as well, but they're not listed. And so his family grows. Abraham did not just have 2 sons, he had many sons. Some of the names that are listed here appear later on in the Old Testament. But in spite of all these children, Isaac is the only one who is the heir. Abraham left gifts for his other sons before he died, but everything was given to Isaac. And then Abraham dies at the ripe old age of 175. Isaac and Ishmael meet after almost 70 years. Isaac was 75 by that point. 48 years, we know nothing of what happened. It's the silent years of Isaac's life. And then Ishmael dies at the age of 137. And his descendants settled down near Egypt, and his descendants grow over time. Well, chapter 25 then, we have the birth of 2 twins. Trouble begins. Rebekah was barren like Sarah. This is almost a repeat story. The situation of Abraham is repeated. Eventually, Rebecca becomes pregnant. It's a difficult pregnancy. The twins are fighting even within her womb. And so Esau comes out first, but Jacob is holding on to the heel of Esau. He came out grasping the heel of his brother. These are two very different people. If you do a little character study of these brothers, they're quite interesting. So Esau, he's the hunter, the outdoorsman. He's the daddy's boy. You know what I mean by that? He liked his daddy, Opa, he liked Esau. Esau was the rough guy, you know. He's the stereotypical hunter, probably had a big beard. In today's world, he'd have a big shotgun, and he'd go out and do the hunting. Jacob is the mama's boy. He's quiet. He likes to hang around the home. He's an inside guy. Esau, he's the tough guy, and he's not very spiritual. Jacob, he's more spiritual. But Jacob, even from an early age, is very selfish. Esau did not care about his birthright. We should talk about a birthright just for a moment. A birthright was very important in the ancient world. It was how so much was passed on in the family. The birthright made whoever had it the head of the family. They were the family priesthood. They got a double portion of all the wealth, and they were designated the ones through whom the covenant would be fulfilled. Those things were not important to Esau. He traded his birthright for a bowl of soup. Now Jacob, he deceives his brother with all of this. And he also deceived his father, Isaac. So we have this problem of a brother who really doesn't care and a brother who's a liar, a deceiver. Okay. I think I want to pause there for a moment, and it's a good point for us to let's continue our walk through Genesis, and we'll speed it up a little bit here. We're halfway through Genesis, but a lot of good material left. Well, in the next part, let me get our notes back up. The next big section of Genesis focuses in on the life of Jacob. Victor Hamilton points out 4 themes in this section of Genesis. Number 1 is the need for transformation. We find out that Jacob has some real character flaws. He has some real challenges, and he needs to change. In chapters 28 to 32, we see the preparation for transformation. His transformation takes place in chapter 32, and then chapters 33 to 36, we see the results of his transformation. In chapter 26, this is a really odd kind of situation in the book of Genesis. Isaac goes through almost the same kind of situation as his father Abraham with King Abimelech. The famine forces Isaac to move south. This is the only recorded revelation from God given to Isaac. God told him not to leave, but Isaac went ahead and left anyway. There's a repetition of the problems that Abraham had with a king named Abimelech. This probably was the son of Abimelech. It could be the same one, but that king would be really old by now. So it's possible it's the same Abimelech, or possibly they like to name their sons after themselves. So it could be a son or a grandson of the same king who Abraham had challenges with. God blessed him in spite of these problems. Isaac went into agriculture and growing things. He moved to the area of Beersheba and he dug a well. And that well is still known today. It's a very famous well. And the promise is repeated to Isaac that was given to Abraham. Esau marries two Hittite women. These were these pagan daughter-in-laws caused a lot of pain to Isaac and Rebekah. Esau did not marry within the family like he should have. Esau was kind of like the black sheep of the family. He wanted to do his own thing. In chapter 27 is the story of Jacob gaining the birthright. And by doing this, Jacob receives the blessing of his father. By this time, Isaac is old, he's blind, he's feeble. Jacob and Esau were 77 years old. Isaac loved Esau. Remember, Esau was the daddy's boy. And Isaac wanted a special meal prepared by Esau. Esau was the hunter. He would bring in wild meat, and that's what his father liked to eat. And so Isaac wants Esau to bring in his favorite kind of food. Well, Jacob hears about this. And remember, Jacob's the deceiver. Esau was a big, hairy kind of man. And so Jacob fools his father, puts, animal skin, fur on his arms, and his old father thinks this is Esau and gives this blessing, very important blessing that he cannot take back. Once he gives it, he gives it. Now, behind all of this is a scheming mother. Remember, Jacob was Rebekah's favorite. And Jacob was the mama's boy. So Rebekah loved Jacob. She did not consult God, but took things into her own hands. Jacob was afraid of being caught in the lie. They prepared a special goat meat, which tasted similar to wild meat. Now, Jacob wasn't going to go out and find meat from a wild animal. Jacob was not a hunter. He was the mama's boy who stayed at home. So they used goat meat, which was similar in taste. And so they tricked Esau together. She was in on this. Jacob flat out lied to Isaac. He abuses God's name in this story. Isaac was suspicious, and especially because of Jacob's voice. It's like, oh, this doesn't sound like my son Esau. Is this Isaac? Or is this Jacob? So he checks his skin. He's still a little suspicious. But after the meal, he gives a kiss, and that smell confirms that, yeah, this must be Esau because it smells like him. You ever been around someone who doesn't take a shower or a bath for a long time? There's just a real strong odor about them. That was Esau. He was a rough guy. And so his father recognized his smell. And the blessing that he gives down in verse 27 is also filled with predictions and prophecies. After the blessing, as soon as Isaac finishes, Esau came in from hunting. And he was going to make this special food and bring it to his father. So he brings us in. He says, "Father, arise and eat, that you may bless me." So Esau was interested in the birthright after all. But because of his scheming brother, he missed out. And if you were Esau, how would you feel? You'd probably want to kill your brother, and that's what Esau planned to do. He planned to murder Jacob after Isaac died. Esau did not have the same faith as the rest of the patriarchs. Rebekah wants to save Jacob's life, so has Isaac send him north to Laban's house, a relative. North, that would be back to the area of Haran and the Fertile Crescent. Remember where they all came from. So Jacob sends Isaac, sorry, get these names mixed up. Isaac sends Jacob back there to find a wife. He does not want Jacob to marry a Canaanite like Esau has done. Esau hears about all of this and tries to please his father by marrying a woman related to the Ishmaelites. So still within the family through Ishmael, but that's not good enough. That's still not part of the family heritage. A real sad chapter if you're Esau. It tells us a lot about Jacob, that he's very deceitful, tricky. It tells us a few things about Isaac also, that Isaac really didn't seem to have a lot of faith. You know, he wasn't a very good discerner and listener to God. He had some, as that's obvious, but there's places in there that you just kind of wonder a little bit about Isaac. In chapter 28, Jacob has a dream. He's on his way for 3 days and has a dream of a stairway to heaven. This is the first of 7 revelations that Jacob has. Jacob has a lot of dreams and revelations. The meaning of this dream, the significance of it was that the angels were ascending and descending upon this stairway to heaven. And they represent the petitions of Jacob being carried to heaven and the answers of God being carried down to earth. Between heaven and earth, there was an uninterrupted communication by the angels. The angels would take these messages back and forth. In verses 13 to 15 of chapter 28, we get the covenant that was repeated to Abraham and Isaac. Now it's given to Jacob, with some special elements added for Jacob's situation. So let's look at those verses. God says, "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your offspring." So we have the promise of land. "Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth." Okay, so now we have descendants. "And you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall all the families of the earth be blessed." So now that we have a third key element of that, the world will be blessed through Jacob. "Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. So another significant passage about the promise to the patriarchs. The dream that Jacob had confirmed the validity and the power of this dream for him. Well, the next part of his life, he works for Laban. Now, this is kind of an interesting passage because remember, Jacob, his name means deceiver, and that's who he is. He's a trickster. Well, he goes to work for his kinsman, Laban, in the area of Haran. That's where they all came from. While at a watering well, he met Rachel, his distant cousin. Laban acknowledges Jacob as a relative. Jacob was with Laban for 1 month, and a formal working situation was arranged. Now, Jacob was attracted to Rachel, the younger daughter. She was beautiful, and he was attracted to her. Leah, the older sister, had weak eyes. She was unattractive at that time. Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Now, Jacob had no dowry. The Hebrew word is mohar, so that he could pay Laban so he could get a bride. And that day you had to pay a dowry to the father so that you could get a bride. Since Laban had nothing, since Jacob had nothing, he had to work for his bride. And so Laban made him work 7 years. And Laban tricked Jacob by substituting, though, at the last minute, Leah instead of Rachel. And so the trick now was placed on Jacob. Jacob was deceived. Well, Jacob really wants Rachel, so he works another 7 years so that he can marry Rachel. He ends up marrying 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel. Chapter 29 is now a competition between these 2 sisters. And this is also the story of how the 12 tribes of Israel came about. And remember, if you know a little bit of Old Testament history from your Intro to Old Testament class, you remember that the northern tribes and the southern tribes did not get along together. In fact, they later split apart in the year 922 after Solomon died. But this was not Solomon's problem. It actually went back all the way to this chapter. The north and the south did not get together because the sons never got together. They fought because the mothers did not like each other. And so the Lord remembered Leah and opened her womb. Rachel remained barren. And so Leah gives birth to 10 sons. And let's see, I want to find the list of those. Chapter 30. And Jacob's servant also bears children. Symbolic names are given to each of the sons based on the meaning of the word sounds similar to the meaning of the name. The name is symbolic for a word that sounds similar. Now Rachel becomes jealous and says, okay, here, you can have my maidservant, Bilhah, to be a surrogate mother for me. And so she blames her problems on Jacob. Leah copies Rachel and gives Jacob, one of her servants. So it's kind of a competition between the wives. Who can have the most sons through Jacob? So let's move on to the last part of chapter 30. Laban, during all of this, was becoming quite wealthy because of Jacob's stay there. But Jacob had nothing. Laban learned by divination that he had become wealthy because Jacob was there. So he did not want Jacob to leave. Jacob was a schemer, though, and he figured out, his little trickster again, he figured out how to get wealthy by deceiving Laban. So he deceived Laban into giving him all the spotted sheep. Sheep are usually white in that area. Jacob practiced selective breeding in order to create a large herd for himself. So he kept true with what Laban wanted, but he did it in a tricky way to make himself a wealthy man. Well, the next part of his life it talks about the return and transformation. Chapter 31 opens with Jacob fleeing from Laban. By this time, Jacob was 97 years old and quite a wealthy man. There's a lot of pressure now for him to leave that area. Laban's sons complained that Jacob had gotten rich at their expense. God appeared to Jacob in a dream that his wealth was because of God's blessing. God directs Jacob to return to Canaan then. But Jacob has an attitude problem in this chapter. He thinks that Laban cheated him and changed his wages. But actually, God was blessing him throughout all of this. Let's go on to chapter 31. Lots of interesting little details I don't want to take time to go through right now. Well, Laban then goes after Jacob because Rachel had stolen one of his little gods. And that ends chapter 31. Now comes a significant chapter in Jacob's life. This is one of those key turning points in the book of Genesis. Remember some of those high points. The turning point for Abraham at Mount Moriah when he offered Isaac. That was a turning point. Now this is a turning point for Jacob. Jacob now hears that Esau is coming, and he prepares to meet his brother, and he expects the worst. It's not going to go well when Esau meets up with Jacob. Now, again, Jacob is the deceiver, he's the trickster, so what does he do? He sends all of the livestock, all of the women, servants, he sends them all first, and he'll be at the end of the line. So if Esau comes, who's he going to take care of first and attack? He's going to take care of all that stuff. And maybe by the time he gets back to Jacob, he'll be tired of fighting and everything. And then hopefully he thinks that he will escape his brother's wrath. He prays to God for protection, reminding God of his promises. He prepared to give a peace offering with many animals, hoping that this would soften up Esau before he actually got back to Jacob. And then he helps his family cross the Jabbok River. Well, as his family goes on ahead, Jacob is back on the other side of the river alone. He experiences a vision in the Old Testament of God is called a theophany, an appearance of God. That's what it means, appearance of God. God appears in human form. This story is really a story of Jacob's spiritual struggle with God. This was not simply a physical wrestling match that Jacob has with an angel who represented God, but this was actually a spiritual battle within Jacob that was taking place. There's this wrestling match then between the angel and Jacob, and the angel could not beat Jacob. This 97-year-old man, and he's a pretty good wrestler. I can't imagine that. I just don't see 97-year-old men wrestling very well. But anyway, the angel was probably taking it easy on him. And so they wrestle all night. And that's symbolic because Jacob has a lot going on in his heart that needs to be cleansed, needs to be removed, needs to be purified by God. A lot of wrestling going on in Jacob. And this physical wrestling match represents the spiritual struggle within him. Jacob just would not humble himself. That's one of the big problems. Jacob would not humble himself before God. The angel used supernatural strength at the end to dislocate Jacob's hip. Jacob wanted a blessing before he would release the angel. Have you ever wrestled before? I don't imagine some of the ladies have done that, but I used to wrestle with my brothers, and actually in physical education in school, we'd have wrestling matches. So I learned about all the moves, and you get a person locked in so they couldn't move. Well, Jacob had this guy in a full Nelson. You know what that is? A full Nelson is where you're back like this and you can't move. So this angel was stuck. He wasn't going anywhere. And Jacob wants the angel to bless him. And so the angel then blessed him by changing his name. Jacob was given a new name. No longer was he the deceiver. He became Israel, which means he who struggles with God. And this also was a new spiritual nature for him. He had struggled with God and came out a different person. He received a new blessing. Jacob had a new testimony now of coming face to face with God and walking away. Although he was wounded for life, he never healed after that. He always walked with a limp as a reminder of that. But yet his life was spared. And something fundamental changed in his life at that point. No longer was he a deceiver. Now he was someone who had come face to face with God, had wrestled it out with God, and came away a new person. This is a powerful story for preaching. The next thing that happens is he does come across his brother, Esau. Jacob sees Esau coming with 400 of his men. That's a small army. He puts his wives and children in the order of importance, with the best last, most important last. In this story, Jacob goes overboard in generosity and hospitality. But Esau, he doesn't want any of it. In fact, Esau welcomes Jacob and is eager to see his family because God has blessed Esau also. Jacob was so cautious and careful. He did not want to, upset his brother because of what he's done. Esau appears to have no animosity now, no hatred towards Jacob. Jacob rejected Esau's offer to go with him and the rest of the journey. And they part ways. Well, that's a significant story of redemption, forgiveness, and blessing. Further journeys, the next couple of chapters. Jacob goes to the area of Sukkoth and builds temporary shelters there. And then he has a rebellious teenage daughter. Anyone have one of those? Dinah, the teenage daughter of Jacob, left to visit the pagan woman. She was raped by Shechem the Hivite. Shechem wanted to marry Dinah. The condition was only if all the Hivite men submitted to circumcision. The sons of Jacob then attacked them after they had been circumcised, while they were in pain. Jacob's sons wiped them all out, looted the city. Jacob is afraid of the consequences. So it's just a sad story all around. And we see it in the Old Testament. There's several women who are victims of rape and incest and abuse. And we've seen several of those in the story already. And we can add Dinah to one of those also. The Old Testament is full of a lot of sadness. It's real true to life. There's nothing that's colored over. And so that makes it hard to read sometimes. But it's true to what life is like. Makes it very historical and believable. And then Jacob and his family traveled to Bethel, which becomes an important name later in the Old Testament. Bethel means house of God. God told Jacob to take all of his family to Bethel. There Jacob buried all the pagan paraphernalia that his family had taken out of Shechem. The terror of God fell upon the Canaanites. And there God built an altar to God. Jacob built an altar to God at Bethel. And again, God appears to Jacob another time and repeats the covenant. So let's look at that in chapter 35, verses 10 through 12. God said to Jacob, "Your name is Jacob no longer. Shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name." So he called his name Israel. Just like Abram had a change of name to Abraham, Jacob now is officially given a new name. And God said to him, "I am God Almighty." There's another Hebrew word, El Shaddai. Let's see. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall come from your own body. Now we have the addition of kings. That was not part of the other predictions. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac, I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Now we have the promise of land repeated. Jacob responds with a drink offering and renaming the place Bethel, house of God. And then there are some losses in chapter 35. Rachel dies, giving birth to a second son. She named her son Ben-Oni, son of my trouble. Jacob renamed him Benjamin, which means son of my right hand. The two sons of Jacob were the most special to Jacob. The two sons of Rachel were the most special to Jacob, Joseph and Benjamin. And so that's why Later on, there's this animosity between the tribes of Joseph and Benjamin and the other tribes. And then Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, dies. He had slept with Jacob's concubine, Bilhah. Jacob did not do anything immediately. And because of that, Reuben lost his birthright because of his treachery and sin against his father. And then Jacob finally dies. Isaac finally dies at 180 years old. Jacob and Esau by this point were 120 years old. Chapter 36 lists, 36, chapter 36 lists Esau's descendants. All right, well, the next part of Genesis, significant part, this is the stories of Joseph. Let's review them real quick. We have the stories of Abraham, just a little bit of Isaac. He's more of a transition person. Then we get a lot of stories of Jacob, and that's important because it describes where Israel comes from. The 12 tribes were the 12 sons of Jacob. And then the next part will be focused on Joseph. Why is Joseph important? Because it tells how Israel got down into Egypt. All of these stories tell something important about Israel and its history. We know Joseph was one of the favorite sons of Jacob, along with Benjamin. There are 4 major periods of his life that are given. The first covers his youth years, and these are summarized fairly quickly in chapter 37. Joseph was the firstborn son of Rachel. Jacob was 91 when Joseph was born. Joseph was 17 years old when he was sold as a slave, just a young man. Joseph was Jacob's favorite son, which created problems with the other sons. The other sons were jealous. His brothers didn't like him. There are some reasons why Joseph had some problems with his brothers. One is Jacob made him a special coat, which was a status symbol. It was a special coat with colors, which back then would have been difficult to do. You would have to dye the cloth and do a lot of work. And so this was an expensive and very visible sign of Jacob's favor upon Joseph. Joseph also, at one point, told on his brothers. He was kind of a tattletale, if you know that word. Joseph had some dreams, and in those dreams, his brothers were bowing down to him. And that made his brothers feel inferior. I think if I was one of Joseph's brothers, I would be mad too. You have this little brother who thinks he's special, who's daddy's little boy, who gets all these special gifts, who thinks he's somebody special, thinks he's better than we are. And so that jealousy and that hatred and that anger begins to boil up in these other brothers. He is hated by his brothers. Joseph is sent out to give some food to his brothers, and they want to kill him. But Reuben intervenes so that they only throw him into a pit. And they tear his special coat off, sell him into slavery to Midianite merchants for only 20 pieces of silver. They bloody this special robe, and then they go and tell a lie to their father that a wild animal had killed Jacob. Well, Jacob had killed Joseph. Jacob is devastated because his favorite son is gone. In the process, Joseph is taken down into Egypt by these merchants and sold as a slave and ends up in the house of Potiphar. And that begins the next major part of his life in Egypt. The purpose of this chapter, according to James Davis, chapter 38, it contrasts the immorality of the brothers compared to the high standards of Joseph, which can be seen in the next chapter. It points out to the importance of getting the covenant family out of Canaan. And third, the stay in Egypt was part of God's providential plan to maintain the purity of his people. This is the story of a messed up family. Joseph was the best of the brothers. Wait a second, I skipped something. Oh, Judah, sorry. Judah was the best of the brothers, but he left his brothers to marry a Canaanite woman. And through her, he had 3 sons. The first one, was so wicked, God just had to take his life. The second son would not fulfill his family duty to bear a son through Tamar, and so was not faithful. The Lord put him to death. The third son was not old enough to marry. And so Tamar disguised herself as a prostitute, which would not have been good. And I'm missing part of my story here. And so she goes in and lays with Judah so that she could have a child. And she gives birth to a son. Judah declares that Tamar was more righteous than himself, and Tamar is listed also in the lineage of Jesus. So another sad story of what happened to one of the ladies, Tamar and Judah. Judah's life really got messed up because he would not listen and he married a Canaanite woman. And because of that, his family had problems. And his lineage came through Tamar. Well, the next part focuses then in on Joseph's life. Joseph is taken into Potiphar's house. He does very well. He excels. He becomes Potiphar's attendant. He's chief of the household, servants. He manages the whole estate. Potiphar was an important person in the Egyptian government. Because Joseph is part of his household, Potiphar is blessed. Now here comes the problem, the test. All of these patriarchs have some kind of test. Here is Joseph's test. Potiphar's wife tried to get Joseph to have sexual relations with her, and he refuses for 2 reasons. One, he could not betray his master. He was a faithful servant. And number 2, he could not sin against God. He stood by his convictions. But Potiphar's wife is deceitful. She tries to force Joseph into a relationship, but instead he flees and she grabs his coat. Well, she goes to Potiphar because she's all angry about Joseph's refusal and tells a lie and says that Joseph tried to rape her. Well, Potiphar's not happy about that, and he has Joseph thrown into prison. So Joseph goes from the low to the high, now back down to the low. At every low, God blesses Joseph because of his conviction and faith, and out of that comes another high. In this case, at the low of imprisonment, Joseph begins to rise in leadership, and the prison warden notices Joseph and puts him in responsibility of the entire prison. The image of Joseph now is developing. He is a strong leader, and he has this reoccurring phrase that the Lord was with him. Look at chapter 39. Let's see, is it 39? Well, chapter 40. Let's see. Yeah, chapter 39, verse 3. This is back in Potiphar's house. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Potiphar saw something special at work in Joseph, and he attributed that to the Lord. Potiphar saw God working through Joseph. Look over at verse 23. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge. He trusted Joseph because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. So the Lord was with Joseph and made everything that Joseph did succeed. The next part is an important indicator of what God was doing through Joseph's life, and that is having dreams. Dreams were important in the Old Testament. We see them talked about many times. Now, not every dream people have is from God, but there are certain dreams that people had, certain people at certain times, that had a message. And Joseph was a dreamer. Two of Pharaoh's servants were also put in prison. Joseph interpreted their dreams with God's help in chapter 40, verse 8. We've had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me. So the assumption is that if you tell me, I'll ask God and we'll figure this out. Well, one of these prisoners was restored to his position, and the other was hung. The cupbearer did not remember his promise that he made to Joseph, that if he ever got out, I'll let them know, okay? I promise if you ever get out, I'll take care of you. But he got out and he never remembered Joseph. It's impossible to know how long Joseph was in prison before these dreams. There's no time indicator of this. So he's at the bottom now. Well, God blesses him. And we see this in chapter 41. No one could interpret Pharaoh's dreams. Pharaoh had a dream of 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows, 7 head of healthy grain, and 7 blighted heads. That's a very strange dream. No one could figure it out. None of the Egyptian wise men could interpret these dreams. Kind of sounds like the book of Daniel, doesn't it? Where Nebuchadnezzar's wise men could not interpret the dream, but only Daniel could. Famine was common in Egypt. Looking at the map of Egypt, let's just take a mental break for a moment and let's find our map. Okay, I got to bring up the web. Let's look at the map real quick here. Map of ancient Near East. Yeah, that's a good one right there. Let's open that. All right. So when we look at Egypt here in this map, you see how green everything is along the Nile River. The reason is that every year the waters and the snow and the rain, all the runoff from further south in Africa would flow down into the Nile River and it would flood. And the water would spread out and then it would recede, and the soil that was left over was very rich and they could grow very good crops. But there were some years when the Nile River would not flood, and so they could not grow their crops because the water would not spread out in the valley. Therefore, they would have times of famine. Well, Joseph interprets this dream. There were 3 seasons in Egypt based on the flow of the Nile. Inundation was time of flood, and that was from July to November. Then there was the coming forth. That's when the flood receded and they would plant the seeds right away. That was November to March. And then there was drought the rest of the year because the Nile River would shrink back to just something small. Nowadays, they actually have a dam, different dams on the Nile River so that they are able to control irrigation, but not in the ancient world. So if the people did not plant their crops, or if the flooding was not very big, then they would face a drought. Well, Pharaoh's cupbearer remembered Joseph and that he could interpret dreams. Joseph interprets the dream to mean that there would be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of drought. And so because of that, Pharaoh elevated Joseph, got him out of prison and elevated him and put him in charge of the plan that Joseph shared about. And basically, he became second in command of the entire Egyptian nation. The only one higher than Joseph was the Pharaoh, eventually. So great power, great position, great influence. So verses 41 to 57 tell us about Joseph's leadership of Egypt. He was given full reign of the kingdom. He married an Egyptian and bore 2 sons named Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, these 2 become important names later on because they will be 2 key tribes of Israel. Joseph is not counted as a tribe, but his 2 sons become separate tribes. During the famine, Pharaoh had complete trust in Joseph, and because of Joseph, Egypt was saved from destruction. Well, the next part of Genesis is the restoration of the family and the prophecies of the future. Well, because of the famine that was happening in Egypt, there was also famine up in Canaan, where the rest of the family was. The family was desperate. They were going to starve to death. So they had heard, like I said, there were a lot of people who migrated down to Egypt at this time because of the famine. And the family was part of that. They went to Egypt looking for food. So Jacob, who's very old at this time, sends his 10 sons to Egypt to get food. And so they go and talk and appear before Joseph. Joseph knows who they are. He recognizes them, but they don't recognize him at all. And he asks them some questions. He asks information about his father, but he can't let them know that it's his father. So he asked them about their father. And do you have any other brothers? What about this brother? He's asking these questions to see if his brothers have changed at all, or if they are still mean, deceitful, angry, and hateful. He tested his brothers to find out the answers. And then he places a little trick on them. He charges them with spying in verse 9. He challenges their answers and integrity, verses 10 to 13. He puts them in jail for 3 days. He asks them to bring the younger brother, which that's going to really devastate their father. Remember, Jacob had 2 favorite sons, Joseph, who's gone, killed by animals, and Benjamin. Boy, if something happens to Benjamin, that will devastate their father. So to make this kind of a fair thing, Jacob makes one of the brothers stay in Egypt. If we look at chapter 42, look at verse 18. On the 3rd day, this is after their imprisonment, Joseph said to them, "Do this and you will live, for I fear God." There's a clue here. Joseph is not some pagan who had forsaken the faith of his fathers. Even though he was in Egypt, even though he had been around the Egyptian gods, and they had plenty of gods and goddesses down in Egypt. Pharaoh was considered a god in Egypt. He never lost his faith in the God of his father Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. If you are honest men, then let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody. Let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households. And then bring your youngest brother to me, so that your words will be verified and you shall not die. Joseph is putting a little pressure on his family, but his motives are good. He's not doing this to be mean. He's doing this in a way to protect them and to make sure that his little brother and his father are taken care of. His brothers do not realize who they're talking about, who this is. Verse 22, so Reuben answered them, "Did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen, so now there comes a reckoning for us." Now Joseph knows who they're talking about. They're talking about him, and they're talking in their own language. They do not know that Joseph knows their language also. So Simeon is kept in Egypt, and the rest of them go back. And Reuben offers to take Benjamin back, but if he does not return, Jacob would kill his 2 sons. Well, that's a nice thought, but it's not very smart. So now the second journey to Egypt is talked about. The hunger forces Jacob now to rethink whether he wants to go down to Egypt. Hunger has forced Jacob to reconsider a trip to Egypt. Judah reminds him of the need to take Benjamin. The brothers all join together, and they are taken to Joseph's house for a meal. But they are concerned about some silver found in their pouches. Joseph was introduced to Benjamin, and he had to run from the room because this was his own brother. He was overcome with emotion. Can you imagine not seeing your brother, your very own special blood brother, for all those years, and he's brought in before you? It overwhelmed him, and he had to leave the room and weep bitterly. And when the dinner is served, Benjamin gets 5 times as much food. There's one more test of honesty in chapter 44. Joseph's steward had placed a silver cup in the bag of Benjamin. After leaving, the brothers are forced to return to Egypt. And now Joseph sees that their hearts really have changed. Judah even says that he would become a slave in order to let Benjamin go. Judah was more concerned about Benjamin than about himself. He would rather change places. So it looks like their hearts were changed. That's something that happened to these brothers over all those years. And then we come to a very moving chapter of the book of Genesis. And that's the story of reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers. Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and he forgives his brothers. He says that when they sold him down into Egyptian slavery, this was all part of God's plan. And it was through this plan that God saved the family from starvation. It was through that plan that they were able to come down into Egypt and to stay there and to live. And so he gives his brothers what they need for the trip, and he tells them, don't get in a fight along the way. Bring back our father. And so that's the story of the closing of the book of Genesis. Jacob at this time was 130 years old. He lived in Egypt 17 more years until he died. Jacob could not believe the news about Joseph. Can you imagine, after all these years, probably 40 years now, and you thought your son was dead, and now you come to hear that he's the second in command in Egypt and that he can save the family? I could just imagine, the tears of joy the whole way until he actually sees his son. Jacob has one final vision in chapter 46. God says in verse 2, Jacob, Jacob, here I am. Then he said, I am God, the God of your fathers. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make you into a great nation. I myself will go down with you to Egypt, and I will bring you up again, and Joseph's hand shall close your eyes. So Jacob would be, God would be with Jacob. He did not need to fear. He was leaving behind everything. Again, everything he had built up, and now to go down. But God gave him these 2 important promises. The whole family goes down to Egypt in chapter 46. This is how Israel ended up into Egyptian slavery. At first they were not slaves. At first they thrived. But then later on, the political situation in Egypt changed, and a Pharaoh arose who did not remember Joseph and made the Israelites slaves. Chapter 46 tells us that in verses 8 through 25 lists the various family members. There are 70 people who migrated down into Egypt. It was a joyful reunion. It had been at least 20 years since father and son had seen each other. By this time, Jacob was old. He's about ready to die. Joseph had grown up. He was almost 40 years old. Joseph seeks and gets Pharaoh's approval for the people, for his family to live in a certain place. Gotta fix that. 47. Joseph has a farm policy. Through this famine, Joseph was able to acquire much wealth for Pharaoh by everyone. The only way you could get anything was through Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh became even richer. There was a 20% tax on the people. And so Joseph was a pretty smart businessman, and it paid off for Pharaoh. And that made Pharaoh even happier. Jacob's last request is given in chapter 47, verses 28 to 31. He lived to be 147 years old. He called his son Joseph and said to him, If now I have found favor in your sight, put your hand under my thigh and promise to deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me in Egypt, but let me lie with my fathers. Carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. And Joseph says, I will do as you have asked. Very likely, Jacob was turned into a mummy, basically, and preserved for 400 years before his remains were taken back to the land of Canaan. So that little statement will appear later and will be fulfilled. In chapter 48, Jacob blesses the two sons of Joseph, Manasseh and Ephraim. In verses 1 to 4, we get a little brief summary of history. God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me and said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, and I will make you a company of peoples, and I will give this land to your offspring after you for an everlasting possession. And now your two sons, who were born to you in the land of Egypt, before I came to you in Egypt, are mine. Ephraim and Manasseh shall be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are. So that's a fairly significant statement right there that we need to look at in the terms of Old Testament history. Okay, Jacob adopts the two sons of Joseph as his own now. And so they become part of the tribes of Israel. And that explains why later on they're listed as part of the tribes of Israel, as part of the sons of Israel. It's because of what Jacob does right here. As for me, when I came to Paddan, to my sorrow, Rachel died in the land of Canaan on the way, when there was still some distance to go to Ephraim, and I buried her there on the way to Ephraim. And then so on. Okay, so let's we're almost out of time, but just a couple of high points here at the end of Book of Genesis. There's a reversal of the blessing. The youngest is blessed first, just like we see in multiple places in the Old Testament. The youngest gets blessed. Jacob's will is that the land will be taken from the Amorites and given to Joseph. So any land in the promised land of the Amorites belongs to Joseph. Jacob blesses his sons then in chapter 49. He gives prophecies about the future of these sons. There's an unusual order for this, and no one really knows why Jacob goes through this particular order. Simeon and Levi were violent, and Jacob sees that here. Now, these two tribes were violent later on in Israel's history. Judah was given the rights of the firstborn. Even though Reuben was firstborn, Judah is given the rights of the firstborn and will be preeminent among the brothers, suggesting in verse 10, in these verses, a royal lineage will come through Judah. And that's what comes, that's what happens. And eventually, verse 10 may be a messianic verse. The scepter shall not depart from Judah. In other words, the king's scepter, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples. So it's through Judah that there'll be a king someday. And we know how some of that worked out. Zebulun would have access to the sea, so he was closest to the Mediterranean. Dan would bring justice to the people, but be like a dangerous snake in the grass. Gad would be attacked, but would drive away people. Asher would have fruitful land. Naphtali would be like a doe. That's a kind of an obscure saying that's hard to interpret. Joseph would overcome tremendous odds to be victor and prince among his brothers. And Benjamin would be the wild and vigorous warriors. And then Jacob dies in chapter 49. Jacob died after the blessing. He was embalmed, mummified for 40 days. It was quite an art, a lot of work in how the Egyptians made mummies. And then was mourned. The brothers still have a few misgivings about Joseph. They're not sure about this guy. The father's gone now. What's going to happen to them? But Joseph is faithful to his promise, and Joseph Joseph is kind to his brothers. Joseph weeps bitterly for the death of his father. Okay, and then let's look at the very end of the book of Genesis, chapter 50, verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years, and Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. He saw his great-grandchildren. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will visit you and bring you up out of this land to the land that he swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you will carry up my bones from here. So Joseph wanted them to carry his bones also. And Joseph died at 110 years old. They embalmed him, made him into a mummy, and put him in a coffin in Egypt. So that ends the book of Genesis. Let's think real quick of some of the key themes and lessons we've learned from this. So you helped me. What are a couple of key themes and points that you remember from our walk through Genesis? What do you remember from this story? What's important? Okay, Sister Ai, you want to share?
Yes po. The main points is from Abraham up to Joseph, up to Jacob. until the last chapter 50 about deceitfulness, lies, doubt. Everyone who's doubting with God's promises will be in trouble.
Mhm.
Everyone who are living in deceitfulness will not growing, will not be transformed.
Mhm. Okay. Thank you.
And one more.
Okay, one
And
more.
everyone who's envy or envious with brothers and sisters would not have peacefulness and good relationship with God.
Yeah.
Like
Or
the
with each other. They had a lot of problems with each other too, didn't they?
yeah. Like the brothers and the brothers of Joseph, because of envy, because of Joseph's intelligence, they were envied to Joseph. That's why they tried to kill him or something bad towards him. So, but Joseph is with God's guidance. That's why Joseph became abundantly.
Mhm.
So every one of us should have to learn that we should not be like that Genesis stories. Number one is lie, deceitfulness, and envy. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, someone else want to add some ideas? What are some big messages that you see?
Uh, for me, Doc David, what I see in this walkthrough in Genesis is the importance of the covenant of the Lord. That if you obey or abide in his covenant, there will be blessings. But if not, you will face the consequences of your disobedience to God. So that's one point that I see in the passage. And also the stories of the patriarch somehow reflects our life in Christ. We've been in times of we were like Abraham, where he was deceitful, and he it was uh, it was easy to compromise things because of when the circumstances were not pleasant or not good or not in his favor. But then but but I am also encouraged of the fact that despite of our weaknesses, the grace of the Lord has been there. The grace of the Lord was there to to help these people grow. So it was really beautiful to witness through the walkthrough that they had their own breakthrough, or they had their own turn the point where they have realized that um, whatever situations that they will be in, they should remain faithful to God. And it's really beautiful that no matter what happen, if we will continue to abide in the Lord, He has many ways to bless us. Thank you.
Thank you. Good insight. Erna has her hand. So you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to add something because the question is the key points for this discussion. I think for Genesis, from the beginning, God has already planned everything. So He let things happen. He let those characters grow and learn during the process. Though there is a betrayal, there is always a forgiveness, and God gave chances for them to change. I think
Mhm.
that's for me.
Yeah. Sometimes people think that God in the Old Testament is full of judgment and war and law. Even in Genesis, we see so much grace, don't we? Yeah, God's grace over and over again. Yeah. Anybody else? Larry, Pastor Larry.
Yeah, Dr. David, I just noticed a lot of exchange in the Genesis. Yeah, first, yeah, I should say first was the ram and Isaac, the availability of the ram, or when Isaac was um, granted his life. Another was the exchange of blessing between Jacob and Esau.
Mm,
And then before, yeah, exchange again with um, the last exchange was the Ephraim and Manasseh.
mm,
So yeah, I think I don't know, but it sounds to me that on the New Testament there was also the great exchange, I should say,
yeah.
that we supposedly receive the punishment, but this time the exchange was we received the unmerited blessing from the Lord instead of the real Son, which is Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
That is what
Yeah.
I.
Notice also that God often chose the youngest, the smallest, the inferior to bring about his plan. Sometimes the deceiver, Yeah. We'll see that later with King David, God chose the least, the small little brother instead of, all these great big guys. Yeah. Well, how about one more before we say goodnight? Anybody have one more idea? Okay, well, that's all right. I hope that now you have something to help you also do your little outline project, your little study of Genesis. Now you can add some of your own ideas to this. Go back and look at Genesis. Genesis is really an important book for us to study because there's so many important ideas in Genesis. Well, next week we will start